Before dawn, the Nile River was a perfect mirror, reflecting a sky the color of copper. Fishermen moved like ghosts across its surface, their oars stirring the only ripples. The air was thick with the scent of wet reeds and the hum of insects. For Egypt, this wasn't just a river. It was the empire's lifeblood, the source of all prosperity. But on this morning, the Nile turned on its people. It started subtly, a stain spreading from the southern bends. Within hours, the serene water deepened into a foul, thick red. The fishermen pulled their nets from the current, but they were heavy only with death. Fish, once silver and vibrant, now floated lifeless, their gills black with rot. A sweet, cloying smell of decay filled the air, clinging to everything. The holy river now smelled like an open wound. In the temples, panic set in. Priests whispered of the sun god Ra's anger, of gods offended by human arrogance. Pharaoh's advisors saw it as a terrible omen, a sign that the sacred balance between the divine and the mortal was collapsing into chaos. But the farmers didn't need theology to understand the disaster. They only knew that the river that fed them, watered their crops, and sustained their cattle, had died overnight. Their livestock refused to drink. A cough spread through the villages, born from the foul air. The book of Exodus would later call this the first plague, the moment God turned Egypt as water into blood. But beneath the ancient scriptures, there's another story, one written not in faith, but in earth and water. Thousands of years later, scientists would find clues pointing to a natural phenomenon, a bloom of a red algae called Oscillatoria rubescens. This microscopic organism thrives when a river's temperature rises and its oxygen levels drop. It starves the water of life and releases toxins, poisoning everything it touches. When the fish died from the toxic bloom, the first domino fell in a devastating chain reaction. Frogs, with their aquatic habitat now unlivable, fled the riverbanks by the thousands. They swarmed the land, covering fields, homes, and even the sacred temples. At first, some people may have seen it as a sign of the Nile's fertility, a strange but hopeful blessing. But their hope turned to horror as the frogs began to die in the oppressive heat, their bodies blanketing the earth in a new layer of decay. The rotting flesh of countless frogs created the perfect breeding ground for the next disaster. Swarms of flies descended, drawn to the carrion, and with the flies came disease, what the Bible would call the third and fourth plagues. Egypt's physicians, the most advanced of their time, were helpless. They burned incense, performed cleansing rituals, and made offerings to the gods, but nothing worked. The people's skin broke out in painful blisters. The livestock collapsed in the fields. It was a perfect, cruelly precise pattern of destruction, a chain of natural consequences that looked exactly like divine punishment. So what could trigger such a catastrophic chain of events? For centuries, scholars have debated a fascinating theory that connects the plagues to a single, colossal event: a volcanic eruption on the distant island of Thera, now known as Santorini. This eruption, one of the largest in human history, would have thrown millions of tons of volcanic ash into the atmosphere, darkening the sky and causing dramatic climate shifts across the region. If this ash cloud reached Egypt, it could have altered weather patterns, leading to a sudden warming of the Nile. A warmer, more stagnant river is the ideal environment for the red algae to bloom. So, the eruption provides a scientific starting point, a trigger for the ecological domino effect that so closely matches the biblical plagues. The science explains the mechanism, while faith provides the meaning. In the grand halls of Thebes, Pharaoh's priests recorded the terror. Ancient scrolls spoke of a river of blood and the stench of death throughout the land. Incredibly, the Ipuwer papyrus, an ancient Egyptian text discovered centuries later, seems to describe the same chaos. The river is blood. Men shrink from tasting it. Plague is throughout the land. Was this just poetry, or was it the memory of a real traumatic event? At the center of it all was Pharaoh, a man considered a living god. His entire authority rested on his perceived control over nature, over the Nile, over the very order of the cosmos. The river's betrayal wasn't just an economic disaster. It was a direct assault on his divinity. He commanded his priests and magicians to perform rites of reversal, to cleanse the water and restore balance. But the river did not obey. The more they prayed, the redder it seemed to become, as if mocking their power. For a people who believed their gods were ever present, this divine silence was more terrifying than any wrathful storm. Historians might call this a textbook ecological collapse. But that clinical term doesn't capture the human terror. What haunts the story of the plagues is the question of intent. Was it a calculated act of God, or a tragic coincidence sharpened into prophecy by human fear? For the ancient Egyptians, there was no difference. Faith filled the gaps that science wouldn't begin to explore for another 3,000 years. And even today, the scientific evidence, while compelling, isn't conclusive. Sediment cores from the Nile Delta do show traces of volcanic ash from the Thera eruption. Microscopic fossils of red algae have been found. It's enough to make the story plausible, but the line between myth and historical fact remains blurred, buried under centuries of sand and interpretation. Yet, the image endures. A red river flowing under a dark sky, an empire trembling on the edge of belief. Whether it was a miracle or a natural mechanism, the event was real enough to scar history. The people who watched their life-giving river turn to blood did not forget. They wrote it down. They passed the story on. They found meaning in the suffering, because without meaning, there is only chaos. Weeks later, the Nile began to heal. The red color faded, the toxins diluted, and life slowly returned to the water. The priests declared the curse lifted. But the damage was done. A seed of doubt had been planted. The people had seen their gods fail. The slaves had seen the mighty empire tremble. And in the heart of Pharaoh's palace, a whisper of rebellion was growing, championed by a man who would demand freedom in the name of a power that Pharaoh could not control or understand. The river healed, but Egypt had begun to bleed, and history was only getting started. Imagine a day that begins without a sunrise, not just an overcast sky, but a creeping, tangible darkness that swallows the world. In the ancient city of Thebes, the air grew heavy, metallic. The priests climbed the temple steps, their eyes searching the horizon, only to see the sky dim, as if a giant hand had brushed soot across the heavens. By midday, the mighty empire of Egypt was drowning in shadow. This wasn't the gentle dark of night. It was thick, suffocating. Torches were reduced to dull, useless embers. A strange wind carried the scent of ash and sulfur. People stumbled blindly through their own homes, groping for walls, for the comfort of another person's touch. In his grand palace, the pharaoh, a man believed to be the son of the sun god Ra, stood staring into a sky that refused to obey him. His voice, which once commanded armies and moved mountains, trembled with a question that no god would answer. For the Egyptians, this was the moment their faith began to fracture. But for the Israelite slaves toiling in the fields, this terrifying darkness was something else entirely. It was the first glimmer of hope. What could cause such an apocalyptic event? Centuries later, science would find a clue buried in the earth itself. The colossal volcanic eruption of Thera, what we now call Santorini, sent a massive plume of ash across the Mediterranean. This plume could have drifted over the Nile Valley, dimming the sun for days, poisoning crops, and blanketing the land in a fine, dark dust, a geological memory of a day the sun vanished. But to the ancient mind, this wasn't a volcano. It was divine rebellion. In Egyptian mythology, light represented order, and darkness was chaos. The pharaoh was the sacred bridge between the two. When the sun disappeared, so did his authority, his divinity. The empire, built on the absolute certainty of the sun's return, began to unravel in the terrifying uncertainty of its absence. The priests gathered in the great temples, their desperate chants to Ra echoing through corridors thick with the smoke of burning oils. They begged the sun to rise. It did not. The chants faded into laments, and the laments into a profound, unnerving silence. Out in the fields, the barley lay still under the weight of the ash. The animals stood motionless. Time itself seemed to stop. Days and nights blurred into one endless shadow. And while Egypt trembled, the slaves watched. Whispers spread among them, whispers of a leader, a man who spoke of deliverance. He claimed this darkness wasn't the death of Egypt, but the birth of their freedom. His name would echo through eternity: Moses. He was not a warrior. He carried no sword. His only weapon was faith, a conviction that a power greater than Pharaoh had decreed this judgment. To the Egyptians he was a heretic, to his people a prophet. In that moment, two men were trapped in the same suffocating night. Pharaoh, fighting to preserve an empire built on gods of stone and gold. Moses fighting to prove a God beyond all empires. Their conflict wasn't just political, it was existential. If Moses was right, then Pharaoh was no god. He was just a man, pretending to command creation. And in the darkness, this terrifying truth began to take hold. Archaeologists have since uncovered thin layers of volcanic dust in the Nile silt, a silent testimony to an ashfall that once covered Egypt. But for those who lived through it, no scientific explanation mattered. The darkness was absolute, and with it came a fear that dissolved civilizations from within. Inside the palace, every lamp was lit, but even their flames seemed to be swallowed by the gloom. Servants moved like ghosts, their faces gray with soot. The walls, painted with golden scenes of Ra's eternal journey across the sky, now seemed to mock their despair. The empire's central belief, that the gods were in control, was bleeding away with every passing moment. And yet, in the slave quarters, a strange calm began to grow. For the first time, the Hebrews felt shielded, not just captive. The very shadow that terrified their masters had become their refuge. They shared stories of an ancient promise, a covenant that was about to be fulfilled. It is said that during those days no man could see his brother. Perhaps it was literal, perhaps metaphorical. In either case, fear made strangers of them all. For Pharaoh, it was the ultimate humiliation. His magicians could mimic tricks with water and snakes. But this, the vanishing of the sun itself, was beyond any power they could conjure. He summoned his priests, demanding answers, but they had none. Their scriptures had no precedent for a god turning against his own son. In his rage and desperation, Pharaoh called for Moses. We can only imagine the words exchanged between the defiant prophet and the broken king. But we know the outcome. Pharaoh refused to yield. His pride, it seemed, was stronger than his fear. And so the darkness lingered. For 3 long days, Egypt remained trapped beneath the veil. Dust settled on the statues of the gods. The great obelisks, carved to honor the sun, stood as black, cold monuments to a failed faith. People no longer prayed for the dawn. They simply prayed for survival. And then, as suddenly as it began, it ended. A weak light filtered through the ash, then grew clearer, stronger, golden. The city awoke in stunned silence. People stumbled into the streets, weeping at the sight of the sun. The priests were quick to claim victory, announcing that Ra had forgiven them. But something had irrevocably broken. The people had seen their god-king powerless. No chant could erase that memory. The Israelites looked up at the same sky, but their tears were different. For them, the light was not a sign of mercy, it was a signal. The age of Egypt's unquestioned power was ending. The age of their exodus was about to begin. In the chronicles of science, the story is one of dust, ash, and atmospheric phenomena. In the chronicles of faith, it is the hand of God. But perhaps the true story lies in the space between those explanations. It's a story about the shattering of illusions and the recognition of how small human power truly is against the vast machinery of the world. Egypt's physical darkness lifted, but its soul remained clouded. Pharaoh's heart, though shaken, hardened once more. Pride has a way of surviving even an apocalypse. But a whisper had now grown into a roar. If nature itself could turn against a god-king, then maybe, just maybe, heaven favors those who have nothing left to lose. The sun rose again, but it no longer belonged to Pharaoh. It belonged to those who had waited in the dark and learned not to fear it. The night was unnaturally still. The air hung heavy, thick with the scent of smoke and grain. Inside the vast halls of Pharaoh's palace, candles trembled against walls of gold, their flames whispering warnings no one could understand. Beyond the marble courtyards, the city of Pi-Ramesses lay hushed, its alleys empty, its fields sleeping under a bruised, silent moon. It felt as if the entire land of Egypt was holding its breath, waiting for something it couldn't name. Pharaoh sat alone in an upper chamber, his face caught between light and shadow. His magnificent robe shimmered, but the gleam of kingship no longer held any power. His advisors had fled, his priests no longer spoke of the sun god Ra or the falcon god Horus. Even they had grown afraid of their own deities. He could still hear the echo of Moses' final warning, a quiet voice that carried more weight than an entire army. "Let my people go, or the firstborn of Egypt shall die." To Pharaoh, it sounded like madness. To the Hebrews, it was prophecy. To history, it was the breaking point. That night, mothers across Egypt held their children close. The firstborn, heirs to family names and fortunes, slept beside their parents, guarded not by soldiers, but by a suffocating fear. Meanwhile, in the slave quarters, the Hebrews moved silently, just as they were instructed. They brushed lamb's blood over their doorframes, a crimson mark that gleamed under the moon, simple yet defiant. It wasn't superstition, it was faith made visible, a gesture that drew a line in the sand between death and deliverance. The Egyptians had mocked them at first, but as the clock ticked towards midnight, the laughter thinned. Dogs began to whine. The wind shifted, carrying a strange chill that tasted of iron and earth. Then came the silence, a vast, unnatural, suffocating quiet. When the first scream finally broke it, it came from the lower district, where the river fog pooled thick and low. It was a father's cry, long, ragged, inconsolable, then another and another. Before the hour was over, the entire city was awake, drowning in mourning. It seemed as if every home, from the humblest hut to the grandest villa, had lost its firstborn son. The sound rose into a single, unbroken wail that echoed across the Nile Valley, a sound so deep, so full of anguish, that even the stones of the pyramids seemed to shudder. Scripture calls this the angel of death, a divine messenger passing over the homes of the Hebrews, but striking down the firstborn of the Egyptians. It's a story of divine judgment, a miracle that set a people free. But what if there's another explanation, one rooted not in the heavens, but in the earth itself? Centuries later, science began to trace the outlines of a very different story. The Nile Delta was known for its massive grain stores, sealed tightly in mud brick silos. During floods and warm seasons, these silos became breeding grounds for a toxic black mold, a fungus we now know as fusarium. Its spores could release a deadly mycotoxin, silently infecting the grain, turning it poisonous. Now, consider the customs of ancient Egypt. The firstborn son, the heir, was given the honor of eating first and eating the best portions. The rest of the family would wait. In this scenario, the poison would have been unknowingly distributed with chilling precision. The firstborn ate first, and they would be the first to fall. It wasn't an angel choosing its victims. It was a biological process, devastatingly effective. To those who believed, it was divine judgment. To modern reason, it's a case of nature's cruel, impartial precision. But to the people who lived it, it was neither. It was grief beyond all understanding. Back in the palace, the royal servants found Pharaoh's son motionless beside his golden cradle. The boy's skin was as pale as marble, his lips a faint, deathly blue. The queen's cry shattered the silence of the hall, and for a moment, even Pharaoh himself did not breathe. His entire world, a world built on the foundations of gods, bloodlines, and immortality, had just fractured with a single silent death. In his grief, he tore his robe. The crown of Egypt fell from his hands and clattered on the floor. Some say that was the moment the soul of Egypt broke. The palace courtyards filled with the sound of weeping. Torches flared against the darkness, their smoke curling towards the heavens like prayers sent too late to be heard. In the slave quarters, the Hebrews waited. The doors were marked, their hearts pounding in their chests. The cries of their captors reached them, but they did not move. They knew this night was not for them to act, only to survive. And then, as the first light of dawn crept over the horizon, a messenger arrived. His voice, trembling, carried the words that would change the course of history. Pharaoh had relented. The slaves were free, but even in his surrender, Pharaoh's heart was a battlefield. Grief had hollowed him out, but his pride still whispered in his ear. He had lost his son, but he could not bear to lose his power. His command to Moses, to take the people and go, was not born of mercy, but of utter exhaustion. The plague had broken his walls, but it had not broken his will. Other historians have proposed different theories. Some point to a phenomenon known as limnic eruption, where a pocket of carbon dioxide gas, trapped beneath the earth, could have been released by minor seismic tremors. This heavy, odorless gas would have rolled along the ground, pooling in low-lying areas near the river. It would suffocate those sleeping closest to the floor: children, small animals, the vulnerable. Once again, nature, impartial and blind, could mimic the work of an avenging angel. But ancient Egypt didn't know science. Egypt knew faith, and on this night their faith had turned against them. The empire that once saw itself as eternal now lay draped in a shroud of mourning. The people buried their children by the hundreds, offering incense to gods who no longer answered. The very air seemed heavy with guilt and sorrow, and in that weight, something irreversible happened. The empire's fear became the Hebrews' hope. The same wind that carried the cries of loss also carried the whisper of escape. Before the second dawn, the word spread among the slaves: "Gather what you can, for Pharaoh has spoken. Leave before he changes his mind." Families packed in a hurry. Their bread was still unleavened, their possessions few. They stepped out into the morning mist, leaving behind the only land they had ever known. The Nile lay silent beside them, its waters reflecting the red sky of a new day. Behind them, Egypt smoldered, its temples still burning incense for the dead, its priests still chanting to a god that would not rise. In that fragile moment, two worlds diverged. One clung to a power that could not protect its own children. The other followed faith into the vast, unknown desert, uncertain but unbroken. It was not triumph that guided them, but something deeper: the raw human will to live beyond fear. As the last of them crossed the threshold of the city, the wind shifted one last time. The cries of mourning faded behind them, replaced by a quiet so vast it felt eternal. Egypt was silent. The Hebrews walked on, each step carrying the memory of the night that had set them free. Perhaps, in another language, this would be called a miracle. Perhaps, in another age, it would be called a coincidence. But to history, it remains a profound mystery, suspended somewhere between heaven and earth, an event too precise to simply dismiss, yet too human to ever fully explain. From his balcony, Pharaoh watched them go. His garments were torn, his face a ghost in the rising sun. Below him, the river gleamed red, not with blood this time, but with the reflection of the dawn. He did not move. He did not speak. He only watched the horizon where the line of former slaves disappeared and knew in that moment that the gods had chosen silence over him. But silence, like grief, does not last forever. Beneath it, something else began to stir, a bitterness that would not rest, a vengeance that would chase them into the desert, because even broken empires have their pride. And Pharaoh's pride, though buried in sorrow. The sea was utterly still, a vast, black mirror under a star-pricked sky. Behind the people of Israel, the torches of Pharaoh's army burned like a string of angry embers on the horizon. Before them, the Red Sea, an impassable wall of dark water. They were trapped, caught between a tyrant's wrath and the unforgiving deep. Fear was a cold knot in every stomach. This was it, the end of the line. Moses, their leader, a man who had already challenged an empire with just a staff and his faith, raised his hand. The simple wooden rod that had once turned the Nile to blood now pointed toward the heart of the sea. And then it began. A low hum vibrated through the sand, a tremor that grew into a deep, guttural groan from the earth itself. Suddenly a wind tore across the coast. Not a breeze, but an ancient howling gale from the east. It ripped and clawed at the surface of the water, a physical force of impossible strength. The air filled with sand and spray, stinging their skin. The people shielded their eyes, watching in disbelief as the Red Sea began to pull back. Inch by agonizing inch, the water peeled away from the shore, revealing the wet, dark spine of the seabed. It wasn't a gentle parting. It was a violent, thunderous spectacle. The waters didn't step aside. They were torn apart. On either side, two liquid mountains rose, trembling, their surfaces shimmering like walls of quivering glass. Lightning streaked across the sky, illuminating the terrifying, beautiful corridor that had just been carved through the abyss. Was this a miracle? A direct intervention from God? Or was it something else, a phenomenon we can now begin to explain? Modern science offers some fascinating theories. Some geologists point to the colossal eruption of the volcano on Santorini around that same period in history, an eruption so massive it sent cataclysmic tsunamis and atmospheric shock waves across the region. Could such an event trigger a wind set-down? This is a rare weather event where ferociously strong, sustained winds can literally push water back, exposing the seafloor for a short period. Imagine a wind blowing at over 60 miles per hour for hours on end. It's theoretically possible. Others look at the geography of the northern Gulf of Suez, an area that was once a shallow network of marshes and reed-filled lakes. Here, a powerful east wind could, hypothetically, have driven the waters back, creating a temporary land bridge. It sounds plausible, a perfect storm of natural forces. But here's the part that science can't quite touch: the timing. For nature to create this impossible path at the precise moment a desperate people stood on the shore, with an army closing in, that strains the laws of probability to their breaking point. Nature might explain the how, but it struggles to explain the why and the when. For the people of Israel, trembling at the edge of this chasm, there was no time for theory. There was only the path. With hesitant steps, they descended onto the seabed. Their feet sank into the soft, cold clay. The air was thick with the smell of salt and ancient sediment. Above them, the two walls of water groaned and shifted, a sound like a caged beast waiting to be unleashed. The people hurried, their eyes wide with a mixture of awe and terror. The men at the rear kept looking back, their torches flickering, watching the lights of the Egyptian chariots growing closer. Then they heard it, the unmistakable sound of wheels on stone, of hooves striking the earth. The Egyptians were coming. Pharaoh, relentless and furious, had ordered his elite chariot corps into the chasm. The bronze wheels churned through the mud. For a breathtaking moment, the hunted and the hunters were suspended in the same impossible passage, a corridor of deliverance that was fast becoming a trap. A flash of lightning illuminated Pharaoh's face, a mask of grim determination, and maybe, just maybe, a flicker of fear, and then the wind died. As suddenly as it had risen, it vanished. A terrifying silence fell, broken only by the roar of the sea. The walls of water, no longer held back by the wind, began to convulse. They didn't just flow back, they collapsed. A colossal, watery fist slamming shut. The sound was absolute, a noise that swallowed all other sounds, the screams of men, the cries of horses, the crunch of metal. In a moment the torchlight was gone. The might of the Egyptian army, the most powerful military force on earth, was erased. What had been parted by a force beyond understanding was reclaimed by nature with brutal, indifferent finality. When dawn broke, the Red Sea was calm again. The surface shimmered, placid and golden under the rising sun, but the shoreline told a different story. It was littered with the wreckage of an army. Broken chariots, splintered wheels, and the bodies of soldiers, their fine armor glinting in the pale morning light. The survivors, the people who had crossed, stood on the far shore in complete silence. The gentle lapping of the waves seemed to mock the violence of the night. For centuries this story has echoed through history, and for just as long we've searched for proof. Archaeologists and oceanographers have scoured the Red Sea floor, modeling wind patterns, analyzing sediment layers. They've found tantalizing clues: underwater land bridges, evidence of ancient shorelines, chariot wheels encrusted with coral, claimed by some to be from Pharaoh's army. While some of these finds are debated, they all point to the whisper of a possibility that the Exodus account is rooted in a real historical event. But maybe the search for a sunken chariot wheel misses the point. The true significance of that night wasn't just about the escape. It was a profound, symbolic severing. The sea didn't just swallow an army, it swallowed an entire age of oppression. It was the moment that forged a group of slaves into a nation, defined not by who they had been, but by what they had witnessed and survived. The story of the parting of the Red Sea teaches us a powerful lesson. Whether you see it as a miracle of faith, a freak alignment of natural forces, or something in between, it represents a moment of profound transformation. It reminds us that sometimes the path forward only appears at the moment of greatest desperation, that hope can be found in the most impossible of circumstances, and that the forces that shape our world and our destinies are often far greater and more mysterious than we can ever fully comprehend. The echo of that night still lingers, a timeless story of faith, fear, and the enduring power of freedom. Thank you so much for watching. If you found this story as fascinating as I do, please hit that like button and subscribe for more journeys into the most incredible stories ever told. We'll see you next time.